Hundreds of pyramids rise from the deserts of Sudan. They are smaller and steeper than the pyramids of Giza, but there are more of them. They mark the graves of kings and queens who ruled one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. And yet, most people have never heard their story. Nearly 3,000 years ago, rulers from the south marched into a divided Egypt. They took the throne, reunited the country, restored its temples, and became pharaohs. History remembers them as the Black Pharaohs. For generations, they were often treated as outsiders who briefly copied and conquered Egypt. But archaeology has overturned that old picture, and DNA research is now revealing something even more important. Egypt and Nubia were never two sealed worlds. They belonged to a long corridor of movement, exchange, conflict, and shared ancestry. But there is a crucial detail. Scientists have not sequenced the DNA of Piye, Taharqa, or any other confirmed Kushite pharaoh. The discovery is not a secret royal bloodline. It is a deeper truth about the world that produced them. To understand it, we have to leave Giza behind and follow the Nile south. Long before the Black Pharaohs ruled Egypt, communities were already thriving in Nubia, the region stretching through southern Egypt and northern Sudan. The river was their lifeline, but it was not an easy road. Rocky cataracts interrupted the current, dividing the valley into natural regions and making invasion difficult. Those barriers encouraged local cultures to develop their own identities. By around 5000 BCE, farming communities cultivated crops, raised cattle, and produced distinctive pottery. Gold, ivory, ebony, animal products, and other valuable goods moved north. Egyptian objects and ideas moved south. Nubia was not an empty frontier waiting for Egypt to civilize it. It was a crossroads. Around the 3rd millennium BCE, one of Africa's earliest great urban civilizations emerged at Kerma. Its capital may have held thousands of people. Monumental mud brick structures, now called defufas, towered above the settlement. Powerful rulers were buried in enormous tumuli surrounded by rich goods and, in some periods, sacrificed retainers. Kerma controlled trade routes reaching far into Africa. During times of Egyptian weakness, it expanded north and became a serious rival. Then, Egypt struck back. During the New Kingdom, Egyptian armies conquered much of Nubia. Fortresses guarded the river. Administrators collected tribute. Temples promoted Egyptian gods and royal ideology. For centuries, the south was drawn into Egypt's imperial system. At first, this looks like the destruction of Nubian independence. Instead, it created the conditions for a remarkable reversal. When Egyptian control weakened, local elites did not simply abandon everything Egypt had brought. They adapted it. They adopted the worship of Amun, hieroglyphic traditions, temple architecture, and the language of pharaonic kingship. But they reshaped these elements inside a Nubian political world. The spiritual center of this new kingdom stood at Jebel Barkal, a striking sandstone mountain near the Nile. Egyptians had associated the site with Amun. Kushite rulers made it the sacred heart of their own monarchy. By the 8th century BCE, the Kingdom of Kush had risen around Napata. At the same time, Egypt was fractured. Rival rulers controlled different regions. Temples had suffered. The political unity that had defined the age of the great pharaohs had broken apart. Then a Kushite king named Piye looked north. His campaign is recorded on a long victory stela discovered at Jebel Barkal. The inscription describes battles, surrendered cities, religious rituals, and even Piye's anger over the condition of captured horses. But it reveals something more important than military success. Piye did not present himself as a foreign raider coming to destroy Egypt. He presented himself as the ruler chosen by Amun to restore order. His armies advanced north, defeating Egyptian rivals one by one. Yet the campaign was wrapped in the language of sacred legitimacy. Piye purified himself before entering temples. He honored Egyptian gods. He demanded submission not merely as a conqueror, but as a pharaoh. That is the first great reversal in this story. The Black Pharaohs did not believe they were stealing Egypt. They believed they were saving it. Piye returned south after his victory, but his successors established firm control. The Kushite kings became Egypt's 25th dynasty, ruling a realm that stretched from the Mediterranean deep into Nubia. They revived older artistic styles, restored sanctuaries, and launched major building programs. Their rule was not a crude imitation of Egyptian civilization. It was a deliberate claim to its oldest traditions. The most famous of these rulers was Taharqa. He built across Egypt and Nubia, enlarged temples, strengthened royal administration, and appeared in the political struggles of the ancient Near East. At Karnak, he added a monumental colonnade. At Jebel Barkal and other sacred sites, his projects linked the northern and southern halves of his realm. Taharqa also appears in the Hebrew Bible, where a ruler identified as Taharqa of Kush enters the struggle between Judah and Assyria. The exact sequence of events remains debated, but the reference shows how far Kushite power had reached into the diplomacy of the Eastern Mediterranean. His monuments presented a confident king governing an immense Nile empire. But that empire stood in the path of another superpower. Assyria was expanding from the northeast, armed with highly organized armies and brutal siege warfare. After repeated invasions, the Kushite kings lost Egypt. By the middle of the 7th century BCE, their dynasty had been driven south. For older histories, this was often where the Black Pharaohs disappeared. But Kush did not vanish. It survived for nearly another 1,000 years. The kingdom's center gradually shifted south toward Meroe, where access to trade routes and natural resources supported a new era. Kushite rulers continued building pyramids, but their art, religion, and architecture became increasingly distinctive. This was not a defeated remnant hiding from history. It was a state reorganizing around a different center of gravity. Royal cemeteries moved, trade networks changed, and the visual language of power became less dependent on Egyptian models. A lion-headed god named Apedemak appeared beside Amun. Royal images blended Egyptian forms with local symbols, and Kush developed its own writing system. The Meroitic script can be sounded out today, but the language behind it remains largely undeciphered. Hundreds of inscriptions are visible. Most of their voices are still silent. Meroe also became associated with iron production. Furnaces, slag heaps, and workshops reveal extensive industry, although historians still debate its exact scale and economic importance. Kush traded with Egypt, the Mediterranean world, the Red Sea, and regions farther south. And political power was not limited to kings. Kushite royal women could hold extraordinary authority. The title Kandake, often rendered as Queen Mother or Ruling Queen, became famous in the ancient world. One of them confronted Rome. After Rome annexed Egypt, conflict erupted along the southern frontier. Kushite forces attacked Roman positions and carried away statues, including a bronze head of Emperor Augustus. Rome retaliated and advanced into Kushite territory. But the war did not end with Kush becoming a Roman province. A peace agreement was reached. The Romans withdrew their demand for tribute, and Kush retained its independence. The bronze head of Augustus was later found buried beneath a temple entrance at Meroe, positioned so worshippers would walk over the emperor's face. It was politics turned into archaeology, a message of defiance preserved beneath the ground. So where does DNA enter this story? For a long time, scholars described the peoples of the Nile Valley through rigid categories: Egyptian or Nubian, North or South, African or foreign. Those labels often reflected modern assumptions more than ancient reality. Genetic evidence is beginning to expose how inadequate that picture is. A 2021 genome-wide study of 66 people from medieval Kulub-Narti in Nubia found a deeply mixed population. Their ancestry combined a substantial Nilotic-related component with ancestry connected through Egypt to populations farther northeast. The study dates long after the Black Pharaohs, so it cannot tell us the ancestry of Piye or Taharqa, but it proves something essential. The Nile was a genetic corridor as well as a cultural one. In 2025, researchers published the first whole genome from an ancient Egyptian of the Old Kingdom. That individual also carried ancestry linking northeastern Africa with populations beyond Egypt. One person cannot represent an entire civilization, and the sample lived more than 2,000 years before Taharqa. Yet the result reinforces the same warning. Ancient populations did not fit neatly inside the borders and racial categories created in modern times. DNA has not revealed that the Black Pharaohs belonged to one simple biological group. It has revealed why that question is too simple. The Kushite rulers emerged from a Nile world shaped by thousands of years of local continuity, migration, intermarriage, trade, conquest, and cultural borrowing. They were Nubian kings with deep roots south of Egypt. They were also heirs to a religious and political tradition that had moved in both directions along the river for centuries. They were neither Egyptian copies nor mysterious outsiders. They were rulers of an independent African civilization that had learned from Egypt, fought Egypt, transformed Egyptian traditions, and finally claimed the Egyptian throne. That is what earlier accounts missed, and much of the story remains unfinished. No confirmed royal Kushite genome has yet provided a direct genetic portrait of the 25th dynasty. The Meroitic language still guards the thoughts of later Kushite rulers. Many archaeological sites in Sudan remain only partly investigated, while conflict and looting threaten irreplaceable evidence. By the 4th century CE, Kush was weakening. Trade routes had shifted, political authority had fragmented, and the kingdom of Aksum was expanding from the Ethiopian highlands. An inscription of King Azana records a campaign into the region, although historians debate whether Aksum alone destroyed Meroe or struck a kingdom already in decline. Even its ending refuses to become a simple story. The pyramids are still standing, the inscriptions are still waiting, and beneath the desert may lie the discoveries that will change this story again. The Black Pharaohs were never a historical footnote. They were the product of an interconnected Nile Valley, and the creators of a civilization that survived conquest, ruled Egypt, resisted Rome, and endured for centuries after its most famous kings were gone. DNA did not give them a new identity. It exposed the weakness of the old one, and it reminded us that history becomes most interesting at the moment its simplest categories begin to collapse.